Greetings from Siberia. One of the most interesting things about living in a cross-cultural environment where you're either living as a foreigner, stranger in a land and looking at their customs and cultures, or even looking back at the your original culture that you left behind, is seeing idiosyncrasies and ironic features of those cultures. For instance, in Russia, one of the things that we always kind of laugh about is International Women's Day, on the 8th of March, which is only celebrated in Russia. International Women's Day. Okay. I know some people down below will say, what about some of the other former Soviet countries? All right, just a few. It still doesn't really warrant the international title. So it's just kind of one of those funny things. And for me, as a descendant of the white American Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage, it's interesting to look back and look at how we in America treat some of our holidays or some of our holy days. For just the secularization of some of our most holy days, Christmas and Easter, for instance, and then the wholesale just up to your eyeballs in witchcraft and wizardry, worshiping of demons and ghouls and all kinds, just playing with that kind of darkness that we do as Christians, claiming to be a Christian nation, claiming to be a Christian culture, and just intermingling that with church, and it just with Halloween, for instance, just boggles the mind. It absolutely is something that I can understand. But today, back in the West, back in the United States, we are celebrating, people are getting ready to celebrating today, St. Patrick's Day, the day dedicated to the patron saint of Ireland. And, we think of St. Patrick's Day, it's wearing green, it's leprechauns, it's three-leaf clovers, it's getting drunk, it's, just all the kind of thing that goes along with what we think of as Irish and Ireland, ale and pubs and all that kind of stuff. And we forget our own heritage. We forget that St. Patrick's Day is the commemoration of one of the great archetypes of a missionary, just the kind of person that we as Christians should hold up as a example for emulation. Something that we could really strive to be like, someone like St. Patrick. So today at St. Patrick's Day, I would like to do this really quick video and give you a bird's eye view of the life and times of St. Patrick. And hopefully when you run into people today and people are wearing green or three-leaf clovers, and you can tell them that it's not about leprechauns, it's about the Trinity. And it's not about just Ireland, it's about the gospel going to a pagan people and turning them from darkness to light. So, St. Patrick was born somewhere around 375, 380 AD to a Christian family in England. Some traditions say Wales, but anyway, North England, somewhere Wales, North England area, somewhere near the coast. We don't know for sure exactly where, but he was born to Christian parents. And as often is with Christian youth, he grew up formally a Christian, nominally a Christian, but as far as his life goes, his own personal relationship with Jesus Christ was very much lacking. He himself, in later life, talks about those early years as a youth growing up in the church as becoming rather debauched and pursuing ale and women and trying to seduce maidens and all that kind of stuff. So one day, while he was traveling from his father's estate to a nearby town where he was hoping to find some maidens of ill repute or something of the sort, he was traveling along a coastline road and was waylaid by pirates who basically were doing a slave raid on northern England, swept him away in their ship, and took him to Ireland, where he was sold on an auction block to a pig farmer. He was pretty much useless as a pig farmer, was often beaten, and he writes about those years of how he was in deep depression and deep sorrow over his life, that he had been a slave to sin and then very literally had become a slave in the pursuit of sin and become a real physical slave. He began to remember his mother's instructions and the things that he had learned in church in early childhood, and began to pray and basically call out to God to have mercy on him. He later realized that it was God's mercy on him that he had been kidnapped and sold into slavery, because if he had just been left to live his life in England, the way he was going was definitely not a way to sanctification, not a way to God in any way. He was going straight to hell. So it was God's mercy in his life. He realized that it swept him away as a slave into Ireland, obtained the grace of God through that humbling experience. So he began to pray that God would have mercy on his soul first and foremost, and maybe for deliverance as a secondary thing. He spent several years, some sources say up to 5 years, in Ireland as a slave, when one day in the forest while he was praying, watching his pigs, he said a cowled man in a robe came to him and told him, "Patrick, you must return to England, go to the seashore, there will be a ship waiting for you." This was a problematic proposition because in Ireland at the time it was a capital offense for a slave to run away from their master, and no matter if you were returned to your master or not, runaway slaves, the penalty for that was always execution, was always capital offense, a capital execution. So Patrick took his life in his own hands by the words of this mysterious cowled stranger, and took off for the coastline, where he found the first ship that he found in the harbor. He basically told the captain, "My God told me that you're supposed to give me passage to England." And the captain said, "Well, I'll be happy to accommodate you as soon as your God tells me the same message." So Patrick is supposed to have knelt down right there on the seashore and began to pray for the ship, and the captain, being somewhat superstitious, did not like that, didn't think that it was a good omen, and so he said, it's cheaper for me to take you free of charge, so get on the boat, we'll go to England. So he got his passage back to England, and was reunited with his family, and dedicated himself to the church, to becoming a priest, and to serving his fellow man there in England back. So he was, for 3 or 4 years, he was at home, training to becoming a priest, and praying that God would send a missionary, some sort of a missionary, to the Irish, because he had, come into contact with the practice of human sacrifice and the Druids and just all the terrible pagan things that were going on there. That people was being devoured by their own pagan religion, and he wished that someone would go to the Irish to preach to them. When again in the forest praying, he was met by the same cowled man who said, "Patrick, it's time for you to go back to Ireland and to share the good news about me with them." And he understood that this was the Lord speaking to him in these visions, and he went and tried to recruit some recruits to go with him on this expedition to Ireland. You have to understand that for the English of this time, Ireland was the land of Druids and darkness and paganism and Vikings and pirate raids. And it was this wild frontier that, there be dragons sort of thing, the place that the Romans didn't even attempt to conquer because it was so far out on the edge of the world, that kind of thing. And so when Patrick went to his church and basically was trying to raise awareness and get recruits to go to this new mission field, it was not met with very much enthusiasm. He ended up going pretty much by himself back to the land of his former captivity. There's a lot of stories about the ways that God moved to open the doors for preaching of the gospel in Ireland. One of the ways was that he was being, some of his Druid opponents were wanting to ambush him in the forest, and him and several of his new believers, the people that had come to faith in Christ, were walking through the forest and had begun to sing psalms. And when they came around the corner, the Druids who were hoping to kill him, who had their swords at the ready, heard the voices of Patrick and his companions singing, "The Lord is my shepherd." But then what they saw was a small herd of deer, which to the Druids was one of their holiest animals, and that was, of course, freaked them out and absolutely put fear and trembling into their hearts about how with this new strange foreign priest who can change himself at will into the form of one of their most holy animals. It was kind of one of those ways that God used to raise the status of Patrick and his mission to the Irish. The long story short is that within the lifetime of Patrick, he was able to translate the New Testament and a lot of other bits of literature into Irish, started the monastic system in Ireland, and founded many, many churches, something like 300 some churches. Some estimates, even modest estimates, say that Patrick, during his time in Ireland, there was something like 100,000 Irish who were converted. As the Irish became more Christian, they began to literally pound their swords into plowshares and become more what we would think of as civilized, less warlike. And this provided an opportunity for a mercenary from England, supposedly calls himself a Christian, to do a retaliatory slave raid against the Irish. And it just so happened that when he landed in Ireland, the town that he was landing on had a whole group of people going down to the river to be baptized, and the slave raiders swept up this entire group of new believers who were going down to be baptized. And this just absolutely enraged Patrick. He felt that this was a betrayal of the Christian mission. How could these supposedly so-called Christians from England come over and do this slave raid against their Christian brothers in Ireland? And he wrote a bull of excommunication against this man and anyone who would dare to communicate with him. This, just like church politics in all times, the person who was excommunicated retaliated with a kind of a gossip campaign, smear campaign against Patrick in his home church and hometown, home diocese back in England, which then he was called out to defend himself and in a church council. And so that's why we have so many documents about Patrick, because there's a court proceedings that tell us what went on. Again, long story short, the council acquitted Patrick and laid some pretty heavy penalties on the slave raiders who had been raiding against Ireland and against the Christians. The question of Patrick, why are you doing this? Why are you fighting for the Irish against the English? And his answer was always, I am fighting for the church, and I am fighting for the cause of Christ. So like I said, Patrick, oversaw the construction, the establishment of over 300 churches and something like 100,000 believers in his time. One of the great hallmarks of his work was that, unlike the Druids, he was very just absolutely dogged about not accepting gifts of any kind from kings or paupers alike, kings, princes, or paupers, that the brothers in Ireland should always support themselves with their own work, with their own hands. And so when this came up in his trial, the English accusers who were accusing him, generating the smear campaign, were saying that he'd enriched himself on the Irish, and he showed that was absolutely, again, just gossip and a smear campaign. And this differentiated Patrick and the Christian priests from the Druids, who were very hungry for gifts, very hungry for all kinds of spoil on religious grounds. And the tradition is, as we know, that Patrick drove out the snakes from Ireland. That the reason why there are no snakes on Ireland is that Patrick, came to Ireland and planted the cross and chased out the snakes and into the sea. And some archaeologists will tell us that there is no archaeological record of snakes at any time in fossil record of snakes at any time in Ireland, and that of course this is just a myth. But I think they're missing the point. The snakes that Patrick drove into the sea were the snakes of paganism, the snakes of human sacrifice, the snakes of the avaristic appetites of the Druids that were destroying and draining their own people. And he brought them the gospel, the light of Christ, and the love of Christ, a former slave who became the patron saint of the island. In that same time period, 405 AD, the barbarians were rampaging across Europe, destroying cities and burning libraries, while Patrick had his mission in Ireland. The monks and the monasteries and the churches that Patrick established began to quickly copy literature for their own use, and many of the Greek classics, the books of science and medicine of that time, were saved because of the missionary work in Ireland. And then from Ireland, several centuries later, 3 or 4 centuries later, when Europe lay in the pangs of the Dark Ages, Irish missionaries from the descendants of Patrick's work came back into Europe, re-evangelizing Europe and bringing them with them not only the original Greek texts of the New and Old Testament, which Patrick had used to establish the church there in Ireland, but also texts of the great Greek science and Greek learning. Or this story you can read more about in the wonderful book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. So, when you're talking about the 3-leaf clovers, a device which Patrick used to explain the Trinity to his pagan listeners, when you think about that, remember that Patrick was more than just leprechauns and gold pots at the end of rainbows. It was a man who spent his life, poured his life out for a people that had the right to kill him, a people that often sought to kill him. But for the love of Christ, he worked for his whole life to show them the gospel. So let us commit ourselves to be like that. And in this day, St. Patrick's Day, when you wear the green, remember that we're talking about the great power of the gospel to dispel darkness and chase away the snakes. Thank you so much for watching. Hope that you enjoyed this video. Like, share, comment below. And as we always say on the Russian YouTube, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So God bless.